Sophie is a translator from the Spanish. She's translated novels by several contemporary Latin American and Spanish authors, including Laia Jufresa, Rodrigo Hasbún, and Alia Trabucco Zerán. She was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2019 and in 2020. In 2020, it was for Hurricane Season by Fernando Melchor, published by Fitzcarraldo Editions. And her translation of Paradise, also by Fernando Melchor, is forthcoming from Fitzcarraldo Editions in 2022. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sophie. I'd like to sort of kick off by asking you quite a general question about your career as a translator. If you could maybe start by telling us how you got into literary translation, and sort of how your career's developed, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for anyone who's come to listen about translating from Spanish, and yeah, thanks again for the invitation. It's a lovely event to celebrate on our special day. Well, not quite our special day, but you know what I mean. It's a bit late, but I'm always late for birthdays, so it's perfectly appropriate. I got into translation, I think when I first got into it, I thought I got into it quite late, and now I'm older. I think I got into it really early and young. I studied. I'm going to go right back to the start, because I think it doesn't matter necessarily what you studied, but what your interests were, and what you studied at university stuff usually shows where interests start to blossom. And I was really interested in English literature. I loved reading what was always called English literature then. Of course, I was reading in translation under the umbrella bracket term of English literature, and loads of it wasn't English literature, but I really had never ever thought about that, like a lot of people like me, I suppose, people who come and realize that they've been reading translations thinking that they were reading English literature, or just not really thinking anything at all. But I loved reading as a child and as a teenager, and then in my early 20s, I did a year abroad, and it wasn't because I was doing Spanish language at university. I got offered to do an Erasmus year just because Leeds University, oh yeah, I forgot, it's a Leeds event today. So Leeds University at the time offered Erasmus to people who weren't even studying languages, which I think does happen in other universities, but then I don't think it was that common at the time. And so I just chose to go to Spain. They still do, Caitlin says, great. And I went to Spain, and I went to Murcia in the south of Spain, and because I didn't know anyone studying Spanish, because I wasn't studying Spanish and I didn't speak any Spanish, I didn't have any kind of expat Erasmus sort of friends really, which was lucky, because after about 6 months of living with 3 Spanish PhD students all studying philosophy and just listening to those 3 kind of wittering on in Spanish, it was like a tap turned on after about 6 months. I hadn't really spoken or said anything until then, and then I realized that I had begun to be really interested in how my language developed as well, and how it comes around. Anyway, cut to going back, finishing English literature as a degree. And then I did comparative literature, and it was there that I discovered that all of this literature that I'd been reading, a lot of it wasn't English literature at all, because there at UCL I was doing comp lit, which for anyone who doesn't know, you often have to have a second language. I'm not sure if that's the case now, but a lot of it is focused around looking at literature from around the world, often comparing literatures from around the world, but also putting great emphasis and focus on the act of translation itself. So translation studies for my master's was a requisite. And thank goodness it was, because we had so many really interesting talks, and people like Anthea Bell came and spoke about what she did as a translator, which fascinated me. I think she also depressed us all quite a lot, because she said you don't need to know any theory to be a literary translator, and we were all there writing essays and dissertations. But it was fascinating. It was great. Pushkin Press came. It wasn't under Adam Freudenheim at the time. Pushkin Press came to speak to us and said, as they still say, and as lots of young publishers still say, or some smaller publishers still go around saying, does anyone here know any books? Have you got any books hidden away, any translation examples? And I remember them being really open to that. which gives you heart and gives you a little confidence boost as a sort of not even emerging, sort of a tiny sapling of an idea of a translator. I went into publishing after that. So I finished my master's, I suppose with my head in the clouds a bit. I thought that I was going to be able to work with high literature, you know, having done that for the last 5 years. And instead I obviously did as much work experience as I could anywhere. And then I got a place in a quite commercial literary agency, and a post opened up as I was doing my work experience. So I was really lucky, and I got to work for a literary agency. The reason why that is important, I think, is because it allowed me to see. I stepped away, I suppose, from literature a bit. In my personal life, I obviously still read, but I was far more involved in things like contracts, in learning how rights, what literary rights are, how they get sold, what scouts are, who owns foreign rights, how there are different people looking after them, how agents pitch to publishers. When I look back now, that was unbelievably helpful. All the time, because I didn't know about translation still, because I still wasn't translating myself, all the time I was thinking, this isn't really what I want to do. It's not really what I want to do. I want to do something more creative, until someone said to me, do you know there's a scout looking for a Spanish reader? And so I started reading, as well as doing my job on the weekends and in the evenings. I started reading books around London Book Fair time and Frankfurt Book Fair time. So that's twice a year. The two, for those who don't know, if you're listening, the two big book rights sales, book rights fairs, where lots of deals get done. And this scout who I was reading for had wanted to be a scout for the whole world. So she needed readers in lots of different languages. And so I was reading loads of Spanish books, or sometimes even Spanish manuscripts before they've been published, to look for the horrible word hot books, which is kind of the phrase that gets used around fair time. Instead, what I was doing was finding these amazing, tiny, not very hot books or tepid books that I thought were absolutely brilliant and literary. And so I would do my job for her and obviously write my reports. But at the same time, I sort of had my eye on these beautiful books that were coming out. One of which made me, it's a cliche, but it's true, made me miss my train stop, my tube stop. And so I decided that I would give it a go doing a sample for it. I think before that, actually, this is, I suppose, goes to show that it was helpful working in a literary agency. Before I did a sample, I wrote to his agent, and I knew that it was okay. I had the confidence to write to an agent, not because I said I'm writing from a literary agent. I was just writing as me, but I knew that these people were not kind of going to go, oh, and sort of balk at this impertinent young woman who was writing to them saying, I've read a book on your list and I love it. Instead, I sort of had this sense that we would just have a conversation about how much we loved this book, and it did turn out like that. And she wrote back saying, actually, I have already pitched this book and no one bought it, but your email has reminded me how much I love it and how much we need to do something. She paid me for a sample, very short. She didn't have much money, but she paid me for a short sample. It got bought by Pushkin Press. I wrote to everyone saying, I'm so happy, well done, I hope the book goes really well. And then they wrote back being, well, we would like you to translate it. So that was the beginning. And then after that, the next couple of books were also ones that I found and pitched, and that was Laia Jufresa. And then I started reporting for publishers. So sometimes a couple of books that I did early on were books that I reported positively on, and then the publishers bought them, and then they said, oh, now since you've read it and you liked it, would you like to translate it? So
which book was it?
Hasbún, the Affections by Rodrigo Hasbún, who's become a really close friend. That's maybe another thing that we can talk about later on. It's like the community that you start to build abroad and at home as a translator, which is without a doubt the best part of the job for me. The friendships and the conversations that I've been able to have with editors, authors, and fellow translators alike. So
something that's really clear from everything you just said is that literary fiction was kind of often there, or you were kind of being drawn to literary fiction as sort of your genre. And I was going to sort of say that, like, as from your books from Hurricane Season and your other work, like they are very much literary fiction. And I was wondering, have you translated anything that wasn't literary fiction, and what sort of your process is and what you like so much about literary fiction? Like, and I don't want to sort of, you know, very firmly, we are all very much here in the camp of every style of fiction is so great. I love romance reads, I love crime, like, but just obviously you've ended up with literary fiction, and what is it that sort of interests you, and what's your process there?
Yeah, I can be perfectly honest. It's just my ignorance. I try not to translate things that I'm completely ignorant of, and so when it comes to like for example, I've always thought I really want to just sort of break both my legs one day, so I can't or both my hands, I suppose, so I can just read for a year and learn about detective and like detective novels that I have this feeling that I'm going to love, but I had no education in it. There were none in my house. I never bought any. Then I went to university, and I suppose was slightly sort of ruined, being channeled down a path of canons that have already been decided for you. And of course that has changed as I've become a translator as well, because I read more broadly. But yeah, in terms of genre, I really do read mostly literary fiction, and I think that's why I translate it mostly. And then there's the question of exactly being known by certain publishers, or in contact with certain editors and certain publishers from certain publishing houses. And I think we do have our niches and our areas, and I don't feel at the moment like I sort of have a huge desire to translate a different genre, because I don't know the writing well enough. So I think it would be almost just sort of a little bit foolhardy of me to think that I could just step into translating a different genre altogether. I
think that shows your sort of wisdom, and I think, you know, having that almost creative decision is what makes you a good, like one of the things that makes you a good translator, you know, is thinking about what am I good at, what am I a specialist in. How is your process of translation? Do you find it an easy thing? Do you do, like, I know some people will do like one full draft, like a blur draft, where they just do it all and they know it's like incomprehensible, and then they go back and edit, or do you tend to make each section good and then move on to the next section? How's that work for you?
Yeah, I'm one of the blur, vomit it onto the page, people, get to the final line. I think it just gives you a false sense of security that you're getting somewhere. Yeah, because that first draft, it has its own delights. If you haven't read the book at all, like some translators do, I always read the book. Sometimes I read it really fast, or I might skip a bit here or there if I have to, but on the whole, I read the book, I get through it, and I kind of know what's happens throughout it. So the first draft is pleasant in the sense that you get to know the book a little bit more, and you delight in it as a reader again a little bit. But it's, for me, the real fun work begins with the second draft, because that's where you start to focus on sound, focus on rhythm, focus on the thing that gives me more pleasure in life than anything, which is synonyms. You know, like getting exactly the right word. There might not be the perfect words, I mean it rarely will be, but you know, the when you hit upon a word that's better than the first one that came to you, then it's really satisfying, if you're into that sort of thing. And then the third draft, I do drafts and drafts and drafts, but there's always one point at which I try to leave it and then come back to it with fresh eyes as a reader again, which I think a lot of people do as well. With Fernanda's book, with Paradise, it was quite painful translating it. It was for some reason, I mean, really terrible things happen in Hurricane Season 2. But this book is there's some violence in it, towards the end that for some reason I really struggled with, and doing drafts and drafts again and again and again of that this time for some reason slightly took it out of me. But at the same point, I still always as a reader was enthralled by it, captivated by it. I was amazed by this change of, you two have read it. It's like no one else has read the book apart from Caitlin and Maddie. It's not out yet, obviously, and the proofs have only just gone to print. So there's that shift in gear at the end and the shift in gaze, and you're like, whoa, and it's like someone's accelerated in a car. You're like, oh, where are we going? And you know where you're going, and it's not going to necessarily be a great place to go, but you're in the car and off you go. And it was always thrilling to translate. I think if you can still feel the thrill by the final drafts when you're still reworking it, I think you've got to somehow, be able to do that if possible. The content of work can be sad and can be testing, and translation is quite draining. I don't mean to be sort of boo-hoo about it, but I often speak to my friend Juana Adcock, who's a brilliant translator, and we sometimes have co-worked together, worked in the same city and sort of gone and sat, and by the end of the day I sort of see her face and I'm like, oh, you understand how I feel at the end of the day. There's something about like having thrown yourself in another world and being in it. I don't even think it's just because there's often quite a lot of trauma that goes on in Fernanda's books. It happens to me with all literature. It's almost like putting yourself somewhere else for the day and like fully engaging in that other place and just concentrating for a long time. I've said it before, it's that I often like we have a lot of discussions as translators about how to review translations and how frustrating it is sometimes when you get a review of a translation that you see of someone else's translations or of your own, where someone's pulled out one word or one line and it feels unfair somehow because they might not have translated it like that themselves, the reviewer, or they may see that that's not somehow kind of sort of an equivalent as they see it to what's in the original. But a good translation or a good translator is one who has the stamina to make the whole work consistent, to make the whole translation consistent, so that you can always justify those smaller decisions, and then you pull apart a little bit and it's almost like a pointillist work. Like that dot might not be perfect, but there's a reason why you use that word instead of that one, because in the next sentence or the next paragraph you had to use that specific word that you might have wanted to use there, but now it fits there better, so you've gone with another one there. So it's this whole connection and web of words and phrases that all fit together, and it takes stamina to get that right, I think. And I mean, we're in an age of golden translators. We've got so many amazing translators who are doing that with every book they produce at the moment.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear the details of your process. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about sort of Fernanda's work specifically, as you just touched on with Paradise, which isn't out yet, and obviously you also translated Hurricane Season. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came across Fernanda's work, and sort of came to translate it and publish it with Fitzcarraldo. Obviously, these are the two that you've done for Fitzcarraldo. And if you could maybe, for obviously those who haven't, yes, as you've mentioned, Caitlin and I are the only two who've had the privilege of reading Paradise so far. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about Paradise and how it compares to Hurricane Season.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet, so I hope I don't. I'm going to make sure I don't give any spoilers. How I ended up working with Fernanda. So I'd heard of Fernanda. When I lived in Mexico, I'd had a meeting with her first publisher. She's now with Random House, Penguin Random House in Latin America. She's published by them. But at the time, she was published by a small, brilliant publisher called Almedia. And they published her first novel and her book of crónicas, like so it's kind of a narrative, long form essays, journalistic essays. That is a form that's really popular in Latin America, especially. Anyway, so I'd been told about her and was given her novel and read a little bit and thought it was really good, but I was working on the really, really long novel I told you about before, and I was busy and whatever, it didn't, for whatever reason, our paths didn't cross again, and I didn't read her again, and I never met her. And in Mexico there is quite a close-knit literary community, so you do tend to sort of meet people, but that was it really for me and Fernanda. And then I got sent in 2018, I got sent Temporada de Huracanes by Fernanda Melchor. So I said, oh, I've heard Melchor's name. And I did a report for a UK publisher. I reported on it in glowing terms. I've never written a report like it. I try to give pros and cons when I write reports. So I think if you are too sort of gushing about novels too often, then the effect of it starts to wear off. But in this case, it was just categorically, you must buy this book. You really, really should buy this book. And I knew the publishers. It's not Fitzcarraldo. That's why I'm not saying the name. It was another publisher who asked me to read it, and they didn't buy it, but they had their reasons. But they said, we can tell that you absolutely love this book, and we're happy for you to take that report elsewhere. That they said that off the bat, sort of thing. And I was really I had a good working relationship with a publisher in the States, with New Directions and with Tynan. We'd just done a book together which I co-translated with Amanda Hopkinson called The Hole by Jose Revueltas, and so I sort of had a sense of what Tynan liked style-wise, and I knew he was commissioning more and more and young writers, and so I spoke to him about it, and he said, oh, I think we might have been sent it, so I'll take a look. And they bought it, and Jacques, I didn't know, but Jacques at Fitzcarraldo at the same time had already seen this book, had already knew he was interested and was already ready to buy it. So he bought it. New Directions bought it, and then I did a sample. They wanted to see a sample, and it was, I don't know, quite a long sample, I think, that I spent a lot of time over. And yeah, and they gave me the job. So that's how I started working with her. And then in terms of working with Fernanda on the text, well, Fernanda is a translator. She's a literary translator from English to Spanish. She doesn't do that much, but it supplements her work as a writer. And I think she enjoys it. And most of Fernanda's reading in her lifetime has been of English books. She's really, really loves American literature, and has read a lot in translation as well, from around the world in English, I think, as well. And she just innately understands that wonderful sort of sweet spot between being helpful and responding to translators' questions and making suggestions that are maybe not that helpful. She's never once made a sort of grammatically incorrect suggestion. In fact, there were only 5 suggestions that she made in the whole of hurricane season, which I was amazed by, and I was sort of hoping for more, but she just said, I can feel it. She was sweet. And I wonder if other authors get this feeling. Like she said, it's amazing to read myself almost like for the first time again, and to be able to like disconnect from my Spanish choices and my Spanish language, but to read my book and have the experience that maybe other people are going to get when they read my work. And so there I sort of knew I must have done okay. And she speaks really good English, so it's nice for me to, yeah, it just gives you a sense of like a bit of calm, that you feel that the person who is able maybe to judge your translation in a way better than anyone else in terms of the experience that it imparts on the reader or for the reader, that she approved it and that she gave it her blessing, but without saying as much. Yeah.
How then with Paradise? So do you say it Paradise? Because it's not Paradise. Paradise. You do say it Paradise, even though it's right. Awesome. So there's a lot of stylistic similarities. She's clearly gone for a similar style. You can even say, so, like I was thinking of it as a little bit as like a an offshoot of, I think Maddie and I were saying, like, it feels really related to hurricane season. Is that something that you feel as well? And how was it sort of, I think somebody's described Fernanda's language, or might have been you, as a torrent of language, and it just pours out like this. Well, how do you think the two books compare?
Yeah, I definitely would agree with you. It's a B-side, I think. It's like an extra track at the end of hurricane season, but also it's so much more than that, because within it, I mean, stylistically, I think it's that. And then I think she was saying, I need to look at the other side of society. So rather than speaking the abstract, I'll explain a little bit for the purpose of everyone else what the book's about. So there's a gardener. The setting is in Veracruz again. It's mainly set in a luxury gated community of very fancy villas that exists in a kind of bubble in the rest of a city where there's a lot of poverty. But the setting is essentially more town and city, more urban than it was in hurricane season, which was set in a village in a small town. Inside this luxury development, there's a gardener, a young guy who's in his mid to late teens, called Polo. And Polo lives in a small, poor town down the road. He cycles in every day. He sweats his balls off every day working in this luxury villa. He has to clean up the dog turds of all of these extremely wealthy, quite kind of garish, ostentatious people, as he sees it. Certainly that's how what they are. And he's fed up. He wants to get out of this town. His cousin, there's a sort of hemorrhage of people. He feels that all the young people are disappearing around him, and he's like, where are they going? Are they getting jobs? Why am I stuck here in my mum's house? His mum's a sort of battle axe and is always telling him he's a waste of space. So there are sort of these similar tropes and figures that you get from hurricane season. And so Polo got a job that he hates, working as he sees it as a skivvy for these people. In the same development is the kind of flip side of the coin. So there is a young teenage boy around the same age who's extremely wealthy, who's spoilt, who is also lost though. He's not at school. He's doing a useless job at school, keeps kind of failing class. He's spends his days playing video games and and basically fantasizing about sleeping with the very attractive young mother of his neighbors. And so he's becoming more and more obsessed with this woman, and is kind of a repulsive figure. His parents have disappeared. We don't know where they've gone, but they clearly don't care that much about him. And he's looked after by his grandparents, who don't have much time for him either. So that's the setup. And basically Polo and this guy Franco, this young boy Franco, come together and hatch a plan that has to do with this woman, and has to do with money, and has to do with escaping and getting out, and has to do with also hating these people. And it's, you know, where it's going really from the beginning. Again, it's a sort of the same form as hurricane season, where you sort of almost know the ending at the beginning, and that's given to you, but you work towards it nonetheless. And so you can see the accident coming. So your hand is sort of always up in front of your face as you're reading the book. But once again, Fernanda wants to know why these two people end up doing what they do, and how they reach the point of how they become so despicable, and where they find the will and the guts to be able to do what they do at the end of the book, and why. This is different from hurricane season too, because Fernanda's clearly thinking about social structures again, but a different side, a flip side. So she's looking at the wealth in Mexico now, not just the poverty, and corruption, and how it corrupts.
Well, I was going to say, to add, sorry, as an addendum to that question, for some reason, I think Maddie felt this way too. Hurricane season is an incredibly brutal read, and there is plenty of violence and horrible misogyny. I found the fat phobia in Paradise almost as close to unreadable as exists. And I like would sort of maybe actually say that if that phobia was really triggering for people, I would say don't pick up this book, like absolutely not. And I was wondering how that is to translate, and sort of I know that you've answered a lot of questions about the misogyny in Hurricane Season and how that was to translate, so I guess sort of on that theme.
There is so many views. Almost every view shared in the entire book from every character is one that I not only feel uncomfortable about, I abhor, and so does Fernanda. So to write it for her must be a strange experience, and to translate it is one, but I do it because what she's doing is exposing the abhorrence of the people who have those views. If it weren't so, then I would feel, I wouldn't do it. But I think that what Fernanda does is say these views exist in the world. Can we try and see why anyone would come to think like this? And what happens when we let people speak this way about each other and to each other and use language in this way? What happens if we keep, like, what starts to erode, what starts to degrade morally, and how does that eventually end up affecting how we physically treat each other? And I think that's something that really interests me. And I didn't realize how much it interested me until I was working closely on Hurricane Season. And I had to sort of use the monstrous language that, but I mean, the point is that I could use it, and I could hopefully make it sound natural to enough people, because I've heard it before. It's not an alien language, is it? We've heard it. We've heard people using it, and so I think her project, her literary project, is an extremely valid and worthy and worthwhile one, because of that. If you meet Fernanda, or if you ever talk to her, she's such a deeply sensitive person. You get the impression that this world that she's lived in as well in Mexico, like these experiences that she's had and seen as a journalist and as a woman, they've really cut deep. And instead of letting it just dissolve her and make her crumble into someone who just can't have any more faith in humans, she said, no, I'm going to turn this into something else, and I'm going to try and understand what drives people.
That's a really sort of incisive explanation of, I think, what she's trying to do with these books. And I think part of why they're so effective is because they get so deeply into the perspective of the characters that it's obviously not being presented as some kind of neutral voice, right? It's like you're in their heads all the time in both of these books. So I was wondering if we could talk a bit about sort of the style of it as well, because as a translation project, because as Caitlin mentioned already, it's kind of like, or as you've said as well, it's very sort of fast paced. It's kind of a wild ride, and sometimes you have these sentences that carry on for like 2 pages at a time. Is that like quite a hard style to sort of wrap the English around?
I don't know. I don't know if it's because it's the second book I've done of it. Alia's last novel was like that. So I had a kind of run of this style that was breathless and lacking in full stops. And so I actually find plain style. I'm translating 2 books at the moment with plain prose, and I'm finding that really difficult. And I'm co-translating them. We were talking before we began about co-translation. I'm really glad I am co-translating it, because I feel that I feel that somehow making that sound natural, just a simple sentence is I'm struggling more. I've never really struggled stylistically with Fernanda, I've got to say. I don't know if it's because she's read so much in English, because sometimes when it comes to Spanish, obviously the syntax and making the 2 languages work grammatically, so it's grammatically acceptable in English, you know, I don't mind pushing English a little bit and stretching it to see where it can go. And I love the idea of an evolving language, especially one that evolves thanks to translations and works being carried over and carried across. But there is a limit always to what a language can do before it becomes gobbledygook, or before it looks like a mistake, I think. And I don't think Fernanda's pushing things so experimentally that it would warrant me doing the same thing. So obviously there are decisions that I have to make, but at the same time, I've always just been able to go and run with it with Fernanda. I've never, stylistically, I don't find it hard to translate as a human. Sometimes I do, but not because I disagree with what's in the book or how it's written. I think it's just because they're so powerful. They're so experiential. They make you feel, I mean, like you've been punched in the gut, or what Fernanda says, no, like what she said, that quote, to break the frozen sea within you, no? And you do feel like that. You do feel like you've been knocked off your sofa, your very comfortable sofa, for a short while, which is why some people don't want to read these books. That's perfectly valid too. Yeah.
Maddie, do you want to ask about comparisons, or shall I go for it?
You go for it, Caitlin.
Or not comparisons even, I was thinking about relationships. Like, so do you sort of work, so you've mentioned a little bit that you work with like Fernanda a little bit, and also with then Alia, so you have these sort of couple of books where you've now translated a couple of works by them. Is that something you want to keep doing? Do you like that? And then also we'll sort of come on to co-translation, which is the process of more than one person translating a book. It has its pros, there are more than one eyes on it, and it has its cons, which is the fee is normally split between two when it's the same fee more or less normally. So I wondered if you want to talk about your relationship with Alia and Fernanda, and then co-translation and what you like about it and why you're heading in that direction.
I think what's really, as I said before, one of the joys of my career has been working with the authors that I've worked with. Not just the authors, but the editors who we end up working with as well, again and again. I'm on my third book with Fernanda now. So with Paradise is Done By, I'm editing and finishing the third book already, which is the narrative, the creative nonfiction. And with Tynan and with Jacques at Fitzcarraldo, Jacques and I do the first, he does the first pass, he edits first, and then Tynan edits, and then I see both of their comments. So I was quite terrified the first time this was going to happen, because I felt, well, like two of my peers, but also the people who I really want to like this work, both of them are going to have a go at it, before it comes back to me. And I was terrified of seeing both these sets of comments and being torn between what one person wanted from another. It couldn't have been further from the truth. Like, the utmost respect, intelligence and wisdom has come out of their edits, and the books wouldn't be anywhere near as good if it hadn't been for their touch. And also because they listen. Like, they really listen. They must not have the time, but they really find the time to talk through problems that you have. And this can be a problem that comes back in the next book, and they're sort of there remembering. So it's really helped. It's like a real support knowing that an editor is like that careful. So that's brilliant, especially working with Fitzcarraldo. And then with Fernanda, so we've never met because of COVID. We've never even Skyped apart from in public for events, and that maybe 3 times. So, but it's lovely, and I kind of hope that it stays like that forever and ever. Not because I don't want to meet her, but because there's something has been forged between us, and we're very friendly now. But also, talking about books that we're interested in and book recommendations, and of course, it's hard for Fernanda because this is a second novel that, like, she's had a huge global success with a book that she wasn't expecting, and also a book that has lots of contentious issues in it. So she's done a lot of talking about the book and about the issues in it. And now with Paradise, she obviously had to exercise the end of that, I think. And so she's had to talk about it all again, and with the fear of the second novel and people saying, well, is it as good as Hurricane Season, or is it like Hurricane Season, and all those things. And so I think just her knowing as well that someone else knows the book really well, and also to bring it back to the words, to bring it back to the literature. So I think maybe she always says to me, ask, there are no stupid questions, because my questions can get down to the smallest minutiae. And like most translators, I'm sure, but it's and she always says, just ask and ask, it's fine, there's never a problem. So that's nice. And the same with Alia. And Alia is a very different character to Fernanda. She's like exuberant. She's a voracious reader. She reads so much. She's constantly writing to me about books, leaves me voice messages about this essay, asking me when was the last hybrid creative nonfiction essay that I've read. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I've ever read one of those. But she just can't get enough of books, and it's so infectious because sometimes you forget because everything's going on around you, and you're focusing on your little small world of Spanish literature, and you forget, like, to take a step away and to read something completely different, which is something that on Alia, like Alia has influenced me to do that. So I'm reading a lot more widely again, which is nice, but not in genres and not in novels. I'm reading a lot of nonfiction, which is good.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and something that I think quite a lot of translators probably talk about and can relate to, is like having to read widely, not just in your target language, but in your source language, in your other language, but also in your own language. And I just wanted to end, before we go to the questions from readers, on a more sort of general question about working as a translator now. Something that we were talking about before is like some of the sort of extra unseen work that translators do, and if you could talk a bit about that, what sort of for you, what the sort of realities of being a literary translator entail, and perhaps maybe if there was anything that you might like advise for early career translators as well.
Yes, I think diversifying in any creative role at the moment is very wise from the offset. It's so tempting to say, I'm going to work up towards only doing this. And it's exactly what I did. I'm going to work towards being only a literary translator and only having books to translate all day long, every day, 365 days of the year. And then I'll have made it. And it's not like that, because it's not for me. I know there are a few translators who work like that, but it depends on your personality. I need more, I need more of a sense of community. So I need to have more interaction and to speak with people more often than that. So for example, I chair events for festivals, mainly for Hay Festival, just because I got in there, and then I've edited book projects and anthologies again with Hay Festival. So and a lot of it links into what I do. So for example, at the moment I'm working with them on an anthology that's linking up the British Museum with 10 Latin American writers, and the 10 writers get to choose from the 62,000 objects in the Latin American collections, and they take one object and they find inspiration in it, and they can write a story or a piece of nonfiction. This to me is the work of a translator. I'm not translating this. I'm helping to, I'm coordinating it really. But that will, that I see that as totally come off the back of my job as a translator. I don't think I would have necessarily, who's qualified to do that job? It seems to me that it would be one person could be a translator, and so there are more opportunities of that kind coming up for translators, running book clubs, like having podcasts, running festivals, like all of this as well is the work of the translator too, if they so wish, or if they are that kind of person who likes to talk a lot, like me. And then scouting, I don't do it anymore because it was too much. It was too busy working, reading reader reports. At certain times of a year, you have to kind of block out a couple of months around that period. So not all. That's not the only time you read for scouts, but it was always very busy around a certain time. But yeah, reading, getting paid to read is a really good way for translators to not only just keep their eye on what's coming out and what's being written, but also to build a rapport with publishers. That's key. It's all about relationships and how you're able to, over time, it takes time, I think. I think back to, you know, I think I had a confidence because I'd worked in a literary agency. So I didn't think these people were completely alien to me. And I knew that they were just other people who loved books. And I tried to think of it that way. And I was lucky to have a boss at the time who encouraged me to see it that way. But at the same time, you are no one at the start, and it's terrifying. And they don't know you. They don't know your taste. They don't know who to listen to. So if you can review books for, you know, for not even for prestigious journals, if you can, great, but just review as much as you can, show them your knowledge of contemporary literature. It's not just about the quality of your translating, unfortunately, because you may have to work a little bit on relationships with editors before they even get to the stage where they read your translation. So it's a real slow burn. But it's such a wonderful job, especially working with the brilliant small publishers who are doing things, and also Pyrini, like doing things like I'm getting to do now, which is mentor a first-time translator. God help her.
That's with the Pyrini Stevens Prize that Maddie administers, and it's this wonderful opportunity for a first-time translator to get a full-length book publication, which is, like you say, one of the hard things to get your foot in the door with. So well done, Maddie, on all your work there.
Thanks. Yeah, as Sophie mentions, Sophie's mentoring our last winner of the prize, Claire Wade, who's translating Manuel Astor's of Saints and Miracles, which I'm sure Sophie will agree with, quite not the easiest text probably for a first-time translator.
No, but she's doing a really scarily good job.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm really excited to see the finished translation.
So that's coming out with Pyrini 2023?
No, 2022.
2022.
Next June. Yeah, it'll be out. So yeah, keep your eye out for that one. Shall we have a look at the chat and see if there's some questions in here?
So I picked out one that was interesting, that sort of relates to literally a conversation that we were having towards the end of the first talk this morning, which is a different question to Fernanda's work, which is really sometimes has really difficult language, but like you fundamentally, you know, believe that it is not her. And actually the difficulty of translating a book that maybe you do fundamentally believe is problematic. And sort of we were talking this morning about a book that is misogynist, and sort of what do you do, and let me get the exact wording, and it was coming up in the English pen debate as well, is how do you translate a book that you find difficult? Do you feel like you have to stand by a book to translate it? And I guess this kind of comes into another question that people have different views on. Do you as a translator change a problematic text to make it not problematic, or do you as a translator translate it exactly as it is and then leave it for the reader to make those assertions? And sort of what's the I guess it's really an ethical question, isn't it? Like, are you putting misogyny, hate into the world, or racism in particular? This question comes up all the time with especially I know in Spanish, like it's holiday heart, isn't it? Rubayo, is that how you say her name?
Yeah. We had this discussion at Borderless when we were reading Holiday Heart by Margarita Garcia Robayo, and I think it's quite a similar kind of issue as with Fernanda's work, where she's portraying a certain type of character and it's from their perspective, and then they express racism and sort of classist snobbery throughout this book. And it was interesting to hear readers talk about it and say, I found this racist. Is it racist to portray a racist character, etc.? Those kinds of discussions come up, and I guess it comes down to separating out an author's views from what a character says, which you can't conflate the two, I feel, ever, really. You have to be very careful about doing that.
Well, interestingly, I think it's almost harder for an author who wants to do that subtly. Like Fernanda's, it's clear that Fernanda does not agree with anyone in her books. I mean, they're just so vile. It's so, I mean, I don't really want to ruin the book or make it sound unappealing to people who haven't read it, because I believe that this book has got the biggest heart of any book I've read in years, because she's willing to go to dark places and there's always a shred of humanity reserved for these people. But that shred of humanity is to show us, to remind us that they're humans, that they're not just the kind of like image of these devils that the news, for example, would have us believe. Like, you know, people have said to me in the past, but how could you live in Mexico? They chop off people's heads there. And it's heartbreaking to hear that about a whole nation's worth of people, you know, and that is the image that is left of the individual people to anyone outside of that context. That's criminal too. So but yeah, it's interesting. I haven't read Holiday Heart, but I can imagine that when it's done more subtly, it's kind of maybe a bit less clear whether it is the author or the.
Also, just with Holiday Heart, I think it's quite a difficult one, because I actually think it could potentially be both. I think that actually her characters are really racist, but I think there's a really valid racist critique of race in this one character's portrayal that actually then leaves me thinking, I think that's problematic. So sort of like it's not always clear cut, is it? It's not always like, as white people, like inherently, like we don't understand that experience, and we are going to make mistakes, and it's not necessarily one or the other. I agree with that.
I mean, I can't talk about, but you know, in the case of racism, I'm clearly white, and so I can't talk about the cost that the toll that it takes on someone to read that and see that presented in that way in a book. If there is a positive to these books where things are hazy being published, it's that we're having conversations, and that maybe white people are becoming clear of the racism that they didn't even understand. And I mean we are becoming aware of the racism that we didn't know that we held on to and have done since birth, you know. And so if there is any, I mean, we're here because we are interested in literature, and we believe that literature helps us to see the world more clearly. That doesn't always mean we're going to see it that sometimes will mean that we'll see it in all its ugliness and all its unappealingness and brutality as well. If we didn't have those things in the book, we'd be in books as well. We're not representing the world as it is. But that's why the conversations now are about the work of being anti-racist are so complex, and why a lot of the advice that's going around is like, just sit with it for a while if you're not sure what to do or what to say or how to represent someone or how not to represent them. Just sit and think then, and wait and keep learning until you can be sure. As a translator, of course, I don't want to translate anything that's going to offend anyone, but that's impossible. So you just have to make sure that you think that there's a reason why that character is in the book, I think, more than anything.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Let's take another question. I liked this one, which is quite broad and general, but I think it's a nice one. So Sophie asks, what translated literature would Sophie recommend for a reader who has just got into translated books?
Oh, okay. So I'm going to start with not translated literature. Sorry, that is annoying because that's not what you asked. But read Polly Barton's 50 Sounds. These are Fitzcarraldo. This is not because it's a Fitzcarraldo event, but read also. Oh, this is awful. This is ridiculous. This Little Art. And this is embarrassing now because it's another Fitzcarraldo book and I've got it here, but also things like Brian Dillon's Suppose a Sentence, that has nothing to do with translation, although some of the books, I think some of the sentences that he pulls apart are translations. But just reignite that sentence level obsession and delight in language with books like that. And for the experience of translating, you cannot really beat, at the moment, Polly Barton and Kate Briggs, I think. Some translators, I'm going to say some translations from recent years that have stood out to me. Frank Wynne, Animalia is extraordinary, unbelievable. Frank Wynne again for Vernon Subutex, that's just an incredible trilogy. There are so many, I don't even want to say too many more. Oh, I think Deborah Smith is amazing as well. Yeah, and they're also just authors that to me now I just don't know what I'd do without them, like Olga Tokarczuk, like what would I do without them? But in both Antonia Lloyd-Jones and Jennifer Cross translations, so many. And the good thing is that I'm not just trying to get out of offering more, because I could just go on and on. But the good news is that if you are interested in saying, okay, I want to read translated literature at the moment, like I think you're in really good hands generally at the moment. I don't remember the last time I read a book and thought contemporary that's coming out at the moment, and I thought this translation is off, really off. I just think that how can we? I don't think there'd be room for someone who was not doing it very well, to be honest, at this stage, because we're so much more aware as an industry. We're not perfect, but we're more aware as an industry of like what a quality translation looks like. I think things are moving in the right direction.
If you want a framework, come along to Borderless Book Club.
Yeah,
like what I was going to say. I mean, come to the meetings, sure, and hear translators talk. Like, I mean, like Sophie has been now. That's kind of what the sort of things we talk about every time. But also, if you just want reading recommendations, if you go to the Borderless website, there's a page where all of the publishers involved in the project are listed, and there's 12 publishers involved now, and all of them specialize in some way. Not all of them do translations exclusively, but all of them publish translations and publish really good translations from different parts of the world. So some, for example, Charco Press does Latin American literature, Tilted Axis Press does Asian literature. You know, there's like different sort of regional specialisms there, but also just generally great translated literature. So yeah, I would recommend that you check out all of those various publishers as well, because as Sophie says, there's loads of really great translators working at the moment, but I also think there's lots of, again, speaking as a publisher of translated literature, but I also think there's lots of really great publishers of translated literature doing great things at the moment. So, yeah.
I can't hype Polly Barton's book enough as well. Like, for the experience of learning a language.
Really beautifully written.
Really good. So another question from Sarah says, what would you recommend to someone trying to get started in literary translation? So you've mentioned sort of making those connections and doing some other work. So she says, you mentioned reading books for a scout and then writing reports. Any tips for finding that kind of work? I guess, how do you even make those initial connections in an industry that can feel very elitist and closed and based on connections? So hard to me.
Yeah, it depends who you are and on your background. Like I think that it's the advice that gets given a lot. I do think establishing relationships is probably not as difficult as it first seems when you start out in translation. So approaching people, like how might I have approached someone, or at the beginning, I think maybe the first people that you can establish relationships with, because you are extremely useful to each other from the outset, is with, if you read a Spanish author or a Spanish language author that you really, really like, and you find it's easy to find out who their agent is online, if they have one. If they don't have one, write to the author, they'll be somewhere online, and write to them to share how much you love the book, and to say, I am an aspiring translator or a translator, depending on where you've got to, you know, and how you feel about where you're at. But just like I can't emphasize enough how important for me it has been having conversations that are joyful about literature with people, and how it's those connections and that's begun to build up a sense with a very small number of publishers that I've really worked with in reality about what my tastes are and what theirs are. So it's sort of write to the Spanish language agents to say, I really, really loved this book. What's the author writing now? Like, are the author's rights sold? I'm really interested. I think that this book would fit so well, you know, with some of the publishers that I read who publish translation, that sort of thing. I think, you know, I don't think that's a strange thing to do. Please, someone put up their hand in the chat if I'm speaking out of turn. But that's how we start. And so then you'll start to be, maybe you'll get on their list, maybe you'll get on their newsletter list, or their list of when they have new books coming out, or and what they do on the whole, agents in other languages trying to sell the rights of their authors into English or around the world in all languages, they'll send out sort of pitch emails saying new book by, you know, whoever, and they'll maybe put a kind of press release and then some quotes, and then they'll put maybe an English sample. More and more often people want an English sample because English is seen as this, you know, it is the lingua franca, so they get an English sample done so that lots of different publishers around the world might be able to read in English and therefore choose whether or not they want to buy this book. So even whether or not the book ends up going to you in English, there's a chance of being paid for doing the sample from the agent. Don't agree to do it for no money. There'll be some money.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Sophie. And for what it's worth, I think that's really good advice, and something that I would say that you've kind of already mentioned is like when you were saying about when you were sort of just starting out, and because you were working at an agency, that you knew that the kind of reaction that you would get is, I think that it can seem really intimidating to talk to agents or authors directly, or publishers or any of that, because you feel like, I don't know, it's not your place or whatever. But in my experience, most agents and so on are usually just quite, like you've said, really happy to talk about their books, and happy to hear from people. So.
And you can hide behind the email as well. You know, if you're shy, if you really don't like approaching people, or if you don't come from the kind of background where it's even ever been remotely possible for you to feel that you could go to some sort of authority like a publisher or an editor or something, and if it's just wildly distant from what you ever thought that you would be able to do, then at least behind an email you get to set the tone and your remarks, and you can just calmly write down your thoughts about a book or an author. And there's, you know, I can't say that they'll answer you, but I think there are lots who do. That's what I want to put out there. There are lots of very communicative and friendly,
I was just about to say,
people working in this job.
No response is not you've been annoying, you've done something wrong. No response is just they're a bit stretched. So don't take it as sort of you've done something. Yeah, no response is just emails.
Keep trying. I think just keep. I know it's not easy. It's never easy when it's a really great creative job, is it? It's like there's not that much space. It's quite difficult. There's quite saturated. But the more books that get published, the more space there'll be for us. So I think that being a promoter and an endorser of translated literature, full stop, can only help to feed into the ecosystem, really, because then there'll be more work for us. That's the idea anyway. So.
Gorgeous. Right, if there's any last questions, please pop them in the chat now. Maddie's keeping an eye to see if we've got any in there. But it's down to me to just say a huge thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we really appreciate you. Round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I really hope, I hope that there was something useful in there. It's a real pleasure to always do an event on our day. Among lovely people.
Thank you so much from me as well. It's really fascinating conversation. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Likewise. Thanks for the great questions.